August 1943. George Patton had just destroyed his own career. After slapping 2 exhausted soldiers in Sicily, George Patton had become politically toxic. Many expected him to disappear quietly. 1 year later, Patton returned, not to rebuild his reputation, to command one of the most powerful field armies the United States had assembled in Europe. In less than 9 months, Patton's Third Army crossed France, broke through Lorraine, relieved Bastogne, crossed the Rhine, and drove deep into the heart of Germany. But speed alone doesn't explain it. Germany was losing the war, but its army was still capable of fighting. It still had experienced commanders, millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks. Yet none of it was enough. So why couldn't they stop Patton? Eisenhower did not remove Patton. Not because he doubted the seriousness of what Patton had done. His letters to Marshall in September 1943 make clear that he understood precisely what was at stake. He kept Patton because he believed the American army could not yet afford to lose him. Patton was, at that moment, the most experienced practitioner of mechanized warfare in the U.S. Army. He had commanded the Western Task Force at Torch. He had reformed Second Corps after Kasserine. He had led 7th Army to Messina before Montgomery. He was, measured by the only standard Eisenhower cared about, effective. But Eisenhower demanded a price. Public apologies. To the 2 soldiers, to the medical personnel, to every division of 7th Army, face to face, unit by unit. Patton made those apologies. He hated making them. He made them anyway. And when the story broke in the American press in November of 1943, after the columnist Drew Pearson revealed it on the radio, the public reaction was immediate and severe. Congressmen demanded Patton's removal. Newspapers called for court-martial. Mothers of soldiers wrote to the War Department. By December, Patton was not commanding an army. He was waiting. 11 months of it. Bradley, who had served under Patton in Sicily, was elevated to command U.S. First Army for the invasion of France. Mark Clark commanded in Italy. Devers organized in the Mediterranean. And Patton, the American expert on armored warfare since the 1930s, studied. Read the campaign histories, traced maps, watched what Bradley did in Normandy, thought about what he would have done differently. The exile that was meant to break him was, quietly, refining him. Before we continue, I'm Charles Mercer, and this is the World War II Grognard. My grandson Will and I spend countless hours researching and writing these documentaries because we believe the Second World War deserves to be understood, not just remembered. Independent channels like ours survive because of people who choose to subscribe. If you enjoy this kind of history, we'd be honored to have you with us. It truly means more to us than you might imagine. Now, back to the story. Ironically, the scandal that almost destroyed Patton made him the perfect commander for the greatest deception operation of the war. Because everyone, including Hitler, believed Patton would command America's main invasion. The first United States Army group, the FUSAG, did not exist. It had no troops. It had no equipment. It had no supply chain. What it had was a headquarters staff, a radio deception program, and George Patton at its head. The Germans knew about it. They knew about it because British intelligence made absolutely certain they knew about it. Double agents in the network Bletchley Park called Double Cross, Garbo, Brutus, Tricycle, and others reported to their German handlers a steady stream of manufactured information. A 1,000,000-man army group, 12 divisions, a landing plan for the Pas de Calais, commanded by Patton. Wooden landing craft sat in Kent ports. Inflatable tanks lined English fields. Fake vehicle tracks scored the mud of southern England. Aerial reconnaissance flights by the Luftwaffe, deliberately permitted by the RAF, photographed all of it. Adolf Hitler believed it, not because he was gullible. He believed it because the deception told him what his own instincts already whispered. The Pas de Calais was the shortest route to the German industrial heartland. The Pas de Calais was where any serious invasion had to come. Normandy, with its inadequate ports, its distance from Germany, its hedgerows, was, in Hitler's reading, a diversion. The real blow would come from Patton, because who else would the Americans give the main effort to? The German 15th Army, some of the finest infantry divisions the Wehrmacht still possessed in the West, sat behind the Atlantic Wall from Calais to Dunkirk, waiting. They were still waiting on June 6th, when Overlord landed in Normandy. They were still waiting on June 20th. They were still waiting in mid-July. 19 divisions, frozen in position, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Because they were waiting for Patton. Think about what this means. 6 weeks after D-Day, while Bradley's First Army bled through the hedgerows of Normandy against the divisions Germany did commit, 19 of the best German divisions in the West did not move. They did not reinforce Normandy. They did not counterattack. They did not maneuver. They stayed in Calais, because a general who did not command a single real division held 19 German ones in place with his name alone. The general the American press had called a disgrace. The general Congress had called for court-martial. The general who, in September of 1943, had thought his war was over, was, by the summer of 1944, the most valuable soldier the Allies possessed in Europe. And he had not yet fired a shot. Before he commanded a single American division in France, Patton had already defeated 19 German divisions without firing a shot. The 1st of August, 1944. The U.S. Third Army, Patton's army, became officially operational in Normandy. Third Army had been building in England for months. 9 infantry divisions, 6 armored divisions, corps commanders, Middleton, Hayslip, Walker, Eddy, who had trained under Patton in the Louisiana maneuvers of 1941. An army built, in effect, in Patton's image. Patton believed speed was not simply movement. Speed was destruction. Every hour a German division spent retreating was 1 hour it could not spend rebuilding. Every kilometer of ground the Wehrmacht gave up under pressure was a kilometer of communication lines stretched, a kilometer of supply route lengthened, a kilometer of reserve position abandoned. An army in retreat could not dig in. An army in retreat could not counterattack. An army in retreat could barely think. Patton's operational philosophy, the philosophy he had refined during 11 months of exile, was to keep the German army in that condition for as long as possible. 6 days before Third Army became operational, U.S. First Army, commanded now by Courtney Hodges under Bradley's overall direction, had launched Operation Cobra. Cobra was Bradley's plan. Nearly 3,000 heavy bombers pounded a strip of German defenses west of Saint-Lô. When the smoke cleared, 7th Corps drove through the gap. Cobra did not fail. Cobra broke the front. By the last day of July, the Americans had reached Avranches. Avranches was, geographically, a bottleneck, a narrow strip of coastal land where the Cotentin Peninsula meets Brittany, the only route south. Every American unit that would exploit the breakthrough had to funnel through that one town. Traffic control at Avranches, in the first days of August, was managed personally by Patton's staff. Third Army pushed 7 divisions through Avranches in 72 hours. 7 divisions, through a single town, across a single bridge, under sporadic Luftwaffe attack, without collapse. Within 72 hours of pushing through Avranches, Third Army was moving in 3 directions simultaneously. 8th Corps drove west, into Brittany, sealing off the German garrisons at Brest and Lorient. 15th Corps drove southeast, toward Le Mans. 20th Corps drove east, into the open flank of the entire German army in Normandy. At OKW headquarters, the Wehrmacht's high command, the reports arriving from France in the second week of August described something the German army was not built to fight. Not a breakthrough, not a penetration, an unfolding. By the 12th of August, 15th Corps had reached Argentan. Argentan was 30 kilometers from Falaise, where the British and Canadians of 21st Army Group were pushing south. Between them lay the entire German 7th Army and most of the 5th Panzer Army, approximately 100,000 men, with much of their armor, packed into a shrinking pocket in the Normandy countryside. Patton asked Bradley for permission to continue north, to close the gap at Argentan-Falaise personally. Bradley refused. The reasons Bradley gave, at the time and afterward, involved coordination with the British boundary, the risk of friendly fire incidents where the 2 Allied armies met, and doubts about whether Third Army, spread across a 200-kilometer front, had the concentrated strength to hold the northern shoulder. The result was that the pocket did not close cleanly. Between August 16th and August 20th, tens of thousands of German soldiers, including much of the officer cadre of both encircled armies, escaped eastward through the gap that Bradley had ordered held open. Historians have argued about that decision for 80 years. The most measured judgment, from the official U.S. Army history, Martin Blumenson's work on the Falaise campaign, and Carlo D'Este's Patton biography, is that Bradley's caution was operationally understandable, but strategically costly. Patton believed at the time that Third Army could have closed it. He may have been right. But Falaise was not the only battle Third Army was fighting. While 15th Corps was stopped at Argentan, 20th Corps and 12th Corps were driving east at a pace that would soon force the German army to admit something it had spent 5 years refusing to consider. The war of positions was over. The war of movement had returned. The Germans still believed they could stop Third Army. They would spend the next month learning they could not. By mid-August 1944, Third Army was no longer breaking through German positions. It was running past them. 20th Corps captured Chartres on the 16th of August. Every town they captured forced another German headquarters to relocate. 12th Corps captured Orléans on the 17th. Every bridge they seized shortened the war by hours. 15th Corps crossed the Seine at Mont-Gassicourt on the 20th. By the 25th of August, Paris, which the German command in the west had planned to defend and had ordered destroyed, was liberated by the French 2nd Armored Division and elements of the U.S. First Army, while Third Army was already 50 kilometers past it, heading east. Reims, sacred city of French coronations, fell on August 30th. Every kilometer stretched the enemy's supply lines thinner. Verdun, where a generation of Frenchmen had died in 1916, was reached on the 31st. Every day Third Army moved was a day the German army could not rebuild. By the 1st of September, Third Army had penetrated approximately 600 kilometers into occupied France in 1 month. 600 kilometers. Across broken bridges, contested rivers, retreating German rearguards, and territory that had been under German control for 4 years. The French civilian population lined the roads. Flowers on the tanks, wine handed up to crews, names written on jeep hoods in chalk. For Third Army, in the last days of August 1944, the war had, briefly, the quality of a parade. Behind the tanks came the trucks. The Red Ball Express, a hastily improvised American supply operation using dedicated one-way routes and round-the-clock driving, moved fuel, ammunition, and rations forward at rates the communication zone had not planned for. Because the communication zone had not planned for this. The Allied logistics plan for the summer of 1944, a plan drawn up in England during the winter, had assumed a slow advance. It had assumed that supply depots would move forward in coordinated stages. It had assumed that ports would open on schedule. It had assumed that the 90-day objective was to reach a line somewhere near the Seine. Third Army was 150 kilometers past the Seine, and it was still August. By the 28th of August, 12th Corps' 4th Armored Division was leading Third Army's advance toward the Meuse River. By the 31st of August, it was out of gasoline. Not out of ammunition. Not out of will. Not out of maneuvering room. Out of gasoline. Patton's response was characteristic. He argued, up the chain of command, to Bradley, to Eisenhower, to anyone who would listen, that if Third Army could be given priority for fuel, it could reach the Rhine before the German army rebuilt any coherent Western defense. He did not get it. The decision Eisenhower faced in September 1944 was, in his position, difficult. Third Army was moving fastest. Montgomery's 21st Army Group, further north, was moving toward Antwerp, a port the Allies desperately needed. Devers' 6th Army Group was landing in southern France. 3 armies, 1 fuel supply. No easy answer. Eisenhower gave priority to Montgomery. Antwerp, as a functioning port, mattered more to the Allied position in his professional judgment than Patton's operational advantage on the Meuse. He was probably right. But by the time Antwerp was cleared and operational, in late November 1944, the German army had used 2 months of Allied logistical constraint to do exactly what Patton had feared: rebuild its Western defense. The Germans had discovered something in August of 1944. They couldn't keep up with Third Army. Not on their own terms. Not on any terms. The only thing that had stopped Patton was Patton's own supply chain. By early October 1944, Third Army was fighting in Lorraine. Lorraine was different. The terrain favored the defense: river valleys, hedged fields, the sodden clay of a wet autumn. The weather grounded Allied air support for days at a time, and the German army opposite Third Army was no longer the disorganized fragments of Normandy. It was First Army, under General Hermann Bulge, who had rebuilt his command around veteran cadres pulled from the Eastern Front. Bulge was one of the most operationally capable German commanders of the war. Patton later would call him, privately, a professional. The city of Metz was ringed by a system of fortifications the Germans had inherited from the French and modernized during the interwar years. Not the linear pillboxes of the Atlantic Wall, not the improvised strongpoints of Normandy. Deep, hardened, mutually supporting fortress structures. Patton attacked Fort Driant in early October with elements of the 5th Infantry Division. The attack failed. The Americans took the outer works, could not hold them, and withdrew after 10 days. It was the first significant tactical defeat Third Army had suffered. It would not be the last. The Lorraine campaign, from mid-September to mid-December 1944, cost Third Army approximately 55,000 casualties. It advanced Third Army's front approximately 65 kilometers. By way of comparison, in August of 1944, Third Army had advanced 600 kilometers. In the fall, 1/10 of that. At more than 20 times the cost. Patton's operational method, speed exploiting an already broken opponent, had produced the summer of 1944. The same method, applied against a coherent defense in bad weather, produced Lorraine. Speed had been destruction. For the first time in the campaign, Third Army had been denied speed. His letters to his wife in November, released after his death, reveal a man deeply frustrated with a form of warfare he considered inefficient, indecisive, and beneath American capability. He was planning, at the end of November, a renewed offensive to breach the Siegfried Line and drive on the Tsar. That plan was never executed, because on the 16th of December, the German army did something that had, in Allied intelligence estimates, been considered impossible. Lorraine had proved something. Patton could be slowed, but slowing him was not stopping him. Just before dawn on December 16, 1944, 25 German divisions, 5 of them armored, struck the American front in the Ardennes forest. 600,000 German soldiers, nearly 2,000 armored vehicles, 2,000 artillery pieces, concentrated on a 60-mile front held by 4 American divisions, most of them either newly arrived or resting after Hurtgen Forest. Allied intelligence had not seen it coming. Or, more precisely, Allied intelligence had seen fragments of it coming and had interpreted those fragments as defensive preparations for the Rhine, not offensive preparations against the Meuse. Third Army was 200 kilometers to the south, poised for an offensive into the Tsar. Between the initial German assault and Third Army, everything was chaos. On December 19th, Eisenhower called a conference at Verdun. The atmosphere in that room was somber. Ike opened by saying that the situation was to be regarded as one of opportunity, not calamity. He asked Bradley what could be done from the south. Patton was ready. He had, the night before, ordered his staff to prepare 3 contingency plans, each involving a rotation of Third Army through 90 degrees, from an eastward-facing offensive posture to a northward attacking one. Patton wasn't improvising. He had anticipated the possibility before Eisenhower even called the meeting. He asked Eisenhower how quickly a counterattack was required. Ike said, as soon as possible. Patton said, in 48 hours. The room did not believe him. Rotating an entire army, 3 corps, 6 divisions plus attached units, artillery, engineers, signal, supply, through 90 degrees, across 100 kilometers of icy roads in winter was not something the U.S. Army had ever attempted. It was not something any modern army had attempted. Eisenhower gave him 72 hours. Patton took 48. Third Corps, General John Milliken, pivoted north from the Tsar. 12th Corps, Manton Eddy, extended its lines to cover the ground Milliken was leaving. The 4th Armored Division, General Hugh Gaffey, led the northward drive. By the 22nd of December, elements of Third Army were engaged with the southern shoulder of the German penetration. The prize was Bastogne, a road junction. 7 roads met there. However held Bastogne controlled the German Army's supply route to the Meuse. The 101st Airborne Division, under the temporary command of Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, had been rushed into Bastogne on the 18th of December. By the 21st, they were surrounded. On the 22nd of December, the German commander besieging Bastogne sent a formal demand for surrender. McAuliffe's written reply, passed to the Germans through the lines, consisted of one word: nuts. When the German officer asked what that meant, the American who delivered it said, "It means go to hell." 4 days later, on December 26th, elements of the 4th Armored Division, coming from the south, from Third Army, broke through to the Bastogne perimeter. The corridor they opened was narrow. It would be widened over the following week. But Bastogne was reached. Patton visited Bastogne in early January. He decorated McAuliffe. He addressed the 101st. He did not, characteristically, use the moment to grandstand. His letters and his personal diary indicate that he considered the Bastogne relief, the 90-degree rotation, the 2-day march north, the drive through winter countryside against a determined defense, to be the finest operation Third Army ever executed. Most military historians agree with him. Rick Atkinson, writing 70 years later in The Guns at Last Light, called the Third Army pivot at the Bulge one of the most remarkable feats of American operational command in the 20th century. Not because it was tactically brilliant. The tactics were straightforward. Patton attacked with force where the enemy was thinnest. It was remarkable because Patton had prepared the option before he was asked for it. Because speed, for Patton, had never been improvisation. It was preparation. The German command in the West, Rundstedt, Model, Manteuffel, had assumed the Americans would need a week to react. They had assumed this because, measured against the operational tempo of any other major army in the war, a week would have been fast. Third Army moved in 2 days. And that difference, the difference between 1 week and 2 days, was the difference between a German offensive that reached the Meuse and one that stalled at Bastogne. In the Ardennes, the Germans had at last been given their opportunity. Surprise, weather, numbers, concentration. Everything they needed to stop Third Army was in their hands. And once again, they failed. By March of 1945, the Rhine had become, in the mind of the German High Command, and in the mind of some Allied commanders as well, the last defensible line of the Reich. Behind the Rhine lay the Ruhr, the industrial engine that had sustained the Wehrmacht for 4 years. Behind the Ruhr lay Berlin. Montgomery had been planning the Rhine crossing since January. Operation Plunder was to be the set piece of the Anglo-American War in the West. 9 divisions, massive artillery preparation, 2 airborne divisions dropping behind German lines in Operation Varsity. Weeks of engineer buildup, assault boats, bridging equipment, smoke generators. Every American and British newspaper knew the date. Every commander in Europe knew the date. The night of March 23rd, 24th. The Rhine crossing was going to be Montgomery's moment. 200 kilometers to the south, Patton was studying his own maps. Third Army had cleared the Palatinate, the triangle of German territory west of the Rhine, between the Moselle and the Saar, in what would later be called one of the fastest campaigns of the war. 10 German divisions destroyed or captured in 10 days. By the 21st of March, Patton's engineers were at the Rhine. Not at Wesel, where Montgomery was preparing. At Oppenheim, a small town south of Mainz. Why Oppenheim? Because it was where the German army was not looking. The Wehrmacht's Western intelligence, what remained of it in March 1945, was focused on Montgomery's buildup in the north. Massive troop concentrations, bridging equipment stockpiles, airborne divisions moving into forward airfields. Everything the Germans knew told them the crossing would come at Wesel. Oppenheim had almost no defenders. On the night of March 22nd, 1 day before Montgomery's carefully planned assault, Third Army's 5th Infantry Division crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim. In assault boats, without airborne support, without artillery preparation, with approximately 20 casualties. 20. Montgomery's plunder, beginning the following night with an artillery preparation involving over 3,000 guns, would produce by comparison several thousand. The following morning, before Montgomery had begun his crossing, Patton telephoned Bradley. "Brad," he said, "for God's sake, tell the world we're across. I want the world to know Third Army made it before Monty starts across." The public relations effect was immediate. For weeks, Allied press coverage had been building toward Montgomery's crossing, the set piece, the engineered triumph, the moment the German West finally fell. Instead, on the morning of March 23rd, American newspapers ran headlines that made Montgomery's operation, launched that night, look like a follow-up. Montgomery, historians agree, was furious. Not because Patton had crossed the Rhine, that was in itself useful to the Allied cause, but because Patton had done it cheaply first and without asking. Operation Plunder, the largest airborne and amphibious operation in Europe since D-Day, was overshadowed in the world press by an assault boat crossing at a town most Americans had never heard of. Later that day, Patton famously urinated into the Rhine. It was theatrical, but the operation itself required no theatrics. Patton had crossed the Rhine one day before Montgomery. He had done it without the massive logistical apparatus Montgomery had assembled. He had done it because Third Army, from the Bulge onward, had been operating at a tempo the German army in the West could no longer match, and the American command in the North seemed unable or unwilling to try. By the Rhine, stopping Patton was no longer Germany's problem. Survival was. By the first week of April 1945, Third Army was inside Germany. 20th Corps drove east from the Rhine crossings, through Frankfurt, past Fulda. 12th Corps pushed toward the Werra River. 8th Corps, Middleton, who had been at Bastogne, moved to seal the southern flank. On the 4th of April, elements of the 89th Infantry Division and the 4th Armored Division, both of Third Army, entered a small camp near Ohrdruf. Ohrdruf was a subcamp of Buchenwald. It had been evacuated hastily by the SS a few days before. The bodies remained. Patton visited Ohrdruf on the 12th of April, together with Eisenhower and Bradley. He walked through the camp with them. At one point, according to Bradley's later account and Eisenhower's own memoir, Patton walked behind a barracks and vomited. This is documented. Patton, who had witnessed combat in 2 world wars, who had ordered attacks that killed thousands, who was famously indifferent to the emotional wear of command, reacted to Ohrdruf physically. Eisenhower ordered that every American unit not in the front line was to visit the camp. He ordered photographers and correspondents to document what they saw. His famous message to Washington, "The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick," was written in the days following that visit. Patton, for his part, did not write eloquently about it. He wrote, in his diary, that he now understood, for the first time, what the war had been for. By the middle of April, Third Army was moving at rates comparable to the summer of 1944. Erfurt fell on April 12th. Weimar, the city of Goethe and of Buchenwald, on April 13th. Chemnitz on the 15th. The German army in the east was collapsing under the Red Army's Berlin offensive. The German army in the west was in effect dissolving. Officers surrendered in groups. Units disintegrated. Civilian populations of German towns waited for the Americans, in most cases, with white flags. Patton wanted Berlin. He had said so in his diary and to his staff since March. He believed Third Army, moving at its April tempo, could reach Berlin before the Red Army closed the ring around it. He was probably right, operationally. Eisenhower said no. The reasons were political and human. The Yalta agreements assigned Berlin to the Soviet sphere. American casualties in a race for a city that would be handed to Stalin anyway were, in Eisenhower's judgment, unacceptable. Patton disagreed. Publicly, he obeyed. Privately, he raged. On the 6th of May, 2 days before the German surrender in Reims, elements of Third Army entered Czechoslovakia and reached Pilsen. Prague was 70 kilometers away. Third Army reconnaissance elements were, by May 6th, close enough to see Czech partisans in the countryside outside the city. Czech civilians who had risen against the German occupation and were fighting in the streets of Prague itself. Patton believed he could take Prague within 24 hours. Eisenhower stopped him. The decision was again political. Prague, under prior Anglo-Soviet agreements, was in the Soviet zone of operational responsibility. Marshal Konev's First Ukrainian Front was approaching from the east. Patton disagreed strongly. His diary and letters from those days reveal a man who understood, earlier than most Americans, what the post-war geography of Europe was going to look like. The Czechs of Prague, who had risen expecting American help, waited for an American army that had been told to stop at a demarcation line. Patton called it a betrayal. Many contemporaries, and many historians since, have argued that Patton's frustration reflected the difficult balance between military opportunity and political agreements already made. 2 days after Third Army halted at the Czech demarcation line, at Reims, General Alfred Jodl signed the instrument of unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. Patton, in the weeks that followed, was appointed military governor of Bavaria. It was, for a commander of his temperament, the wrong assignment. The occupation required political sensitivity, denazification, cooperation with civilian administrators, restraint in speaking to the press. Patton, who had never been restrained in speaking to the press, and who had come to see the Soviet Union, not the defeated Nazi regime, as the primary threat to Western Europe, began saying so publicly. He kept former Nazi Party members in administrative positions because, in his judgment, they were the only competent administrators available. He suggested, to reporters, that a war with the Soviet Union was inevitable. Eisenhower removed him from Third Army Command in early October. The commander who had crossed the Rhine before Montgomery, who had relieved Bastogne in 48 hours, who had penetrated further into Germany than any other Western general, was reassigned to the paper command of the 15th Army, a headquarters staff writing the U.S. Army's history of the European campaign. It was a graceful way, in Eisenhower's terms, of taking a field command away from a man who could no longer politically survive holding one. Patton understood it exactly as it was intended. On the 9th of December 1945, near Mannheim, Patton was riding in a Cadillac staff car when it collided with an American Army truck at a rail crossing. The other passengers were unhurt. Patton, thrown forward, struck his head against the metal partition behind the driver. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He died 12 days later in a Heidelberg military hospital on the 21st of December. He was 60 years old. His combat war in Europe had lasted, from the moment Third Army became operational to the moment the war ended, exactly 10 months and 8 days. Why couldn't Germany stop Patton? The mythological answer, the answer most often given in popular treatments, is that Patton was a military genius, a visionary of armored warfare, a one-in-a-generation battlefield commander whose personal qualities defeated everything in his path. That answer is not entirely wrong. Patton was, by any measure, one of the ablest operational commanders the American Army produced in the 20th century. But it is incomplete. Throughout the campaign, German commanders fought Patton again and again. Yet none of them were really fighting Patton alone. There are 3 deeper reasons, and each one matters. The first is that by the summer of 1944, the German army in the West was no longer the German army that had conquered France in 1940. It had bled for 3 years on the Eastern Front. Its best divisions were dead or captured at Stalingrad, Kursk, Bagration. Its officer corps was thin, its equipment was outmatched, its fuel supply, after the collapse of the Romanian oil fields in the summer of 1944, was catastrophic. Patton did not defeat the Wehrmacht of 1940. He defeated a Wehrmacht that had already been broken elsewhere. That is not a criticism of Patton. It is a recognition that the conditions of his greatest campaign, August 1944, were shaped by a strategic outcome he did not personally produce. The second reason is that Patton commanded an army the German army could not, by 1944, match. Third Army had more trucks than the entire Wehrmacht possessed in the West. It had radios in every tank. It had air support on call. It had the Red Ball Express behind it. American industrial output, in 1944, produced more military vehicles in 3 months than Germany produced during the entire war. Patton's operational speed was made possible by the logistical apparatus his army possessed. An identical general, with an identical mind, commanding a Wehrmacht panzer army in the summer of 1944, would have advanced perhaps a fifth as fast, because he would have run out of fuel. The third reason, and this is where Patton's personal contribution enters, is that Patton understood, more deeply than most commanders of any nationality, what an army moving at operational speed could accomplish against an army that could not react quickly. He had studied the theory since the interwar years. He had watched the Germans use it, against him, in North Africa. He had refined his own version in Sicily. By the time he took command of Third Army, he had done more thinking about mechanized operational tempo than any other American commander. Speed had never been style. Speed had been the entire theory. Not because he was a genius, because he had been waiting 11 months, with nothing else to do, to prove that he still deserved a command. Germany never really solved the Patton problem. Not because Patton never made mistakes. He made plenty. Not because Third Army was invincible. It wasn't. Germany failed because by the summer of 1944, Patton had become something far more dangerous than an aggressive commander. He had become the operational expression of American industry, American logistics, and American mobility. Stopping George Patton meant stopping all three. And by 1944, Germany no longer could. Thank you for watching. If this is the kind of history you're looking for, subscribe. There's always another story waiting. The next documentary starts right after this one.